Okay, so welcome to the second episode of Manifold Solutions podcast. In this episode, I have a guest, Dr. Juhani Koivisto, whom we met with whom we met at the University of Helsinki when we were both doing our PhDs. You graduated in 2016 from your PhD, and you did it in coarse geometry.
Precisely.
Coarse isometry. This is a part of geometry. If you can describe in one or two sentences what it is.
So it's when something originally you don't have any geometry, it looks like a mess, but then when you go infinitely afar, it gets some structure and it obtains some geometry. And Richard Gromov introduced this in 83. So if you would have a band of beads, when you look closely at it, you can see the beads and it's discrete. And then when you go infinitely afar, the beads start to get closer and closer. And when you're in the sense of quasi-isometry infinitely afar, you will see a nice line and you have obtained classic Euclidean one-dimensional geometry. And if you would have a grid, you would obtain the plane. And of course, then in coarse geometry, you look at more complex situations where you want to use geometry.
So it's like zooming out, and it's not topology, but it's like geometry has different branches that nowadays. Geometry used to be very rigid, like 1,000 years ago, but today we have topology, we have metric geometry, we have hyperbolic, like manifold, different types of manifold, differential geometry, and this is something that maybe is less known, coarse geometry.
Yeah, it's quite new. John Rowe came up with the kind of formalization to coarse geometry that generalized what Gromov originally had. And you can see in topology, you have neighborhoods which define closeness. 2 points are close if they belong to the same neighborhood in some sense. And you build this on the subset of the power set of the space. And then this notion of coarseness that John Rowe gave, kind of extending these or abstracting these notions, is again on the power set of the Cartesian product, where you have so-called entourages where you do this thing, and they've had different versions of this, right? So it's a very interesting opposite, or in some sense dual to topology.
Right. Are you a visual thinker?
I would say that depends. In many parts of life, I am. However, in math, I am not so sure if I am. That's kind of hard, but usually the way I come up with proofs, I think about equations and not so much about images, although I might think about, or in terms of images in a lot of other things in life. I think it also depends on the question you're thinking about. I would say somewhere in between.
Okay. And okay, so you graduated, and then during your PhD, you worked a little bit in Israel, and then afterwards you went to Denmark and France and Paris, and then you ended up back in Finland during pandemic, and then you transitioned to work in industry, and now you work as a risk analyst for banks, Nordea at this moment. And I want to touch on all of these things. And in particular, another thing about Juhani is that he is a dancer. So a dancing mathematician. There was a little documentary made by the Finnish TV, Yle, where Juhani presented dance and mathematics as kind of going hand in hand in your life or in your career, and that's a very interesting thing to me. that it appears to me, and I'd like to hear your thoughts, that mathematics and dance to you on one hand are somehow opposites, so they counterbalance each other. On the other hand, they're somehow very similar and they have the same feeling of creativity. How would you describe?
You might actually have experience of this yourself because of acrobatics
Right.
and how that feels for you also as a mathematician to do and the similarities there. Of course, there is one part that math is very much something that happens in your head and you are really thinking when you do it. But in acrobatics and in dance, you may recognize that if you start thinking, things will go very wrong.
Right.
So you will have to concentrate in a very different way. And I think these two different ways of concentrating complement each other.
Yeah, and I realized that you actually introduced me to acrobatics in 2016 when I came back, or 15 when I came back from Vienna, from my postdoc in Vienna, and we were discussing, and you told me that you were doing acrobatics, and then that inspired me, and now I am going with my son, who is 10 months, we do baby acrobatics.
Very happy to hear that.
That's that has really influenced my life, actually. So you are right. When I do acrobatics, it is thinking about the body. So it's like the embodied intelligence, much more than in mathematics. It's very complementary in a way. I remember when I was doing it more actively that very often, like, it's so difficult to understand how can my body go like this. You look at the teacher and you're like, okay, I can understand in theory, but then when I do it myself, it feels weird, like, oh, now I have to move this weight here and now I have to move this hand there, or it doesn't go there.
Yeah.
It's very different. Yeah, it's a very different way of thinking. At the same time, it's kind of geometric. It's kind of a different dimension of geometry.
Exactly. And I think also doing it, even if it's a different way of thinking, maybe they each other also complement, so that if you have difficulties in one, maybe you can turn it out into a solution in a very indirect way in the other one. Maybe it's similar to going for a walk when you cannot solve a problem. It's comparable, but in a way also different because it requires more of something that's very hard to verbalize, but some kind of other way of solving problems with your mind and body.
Right. So applying skills in one domain in another domain, and this brings me back to your situation that you quit working in academia, although you're still involved, you're still catching up with academic stuff, and you transition to industry. And how does the skills you learn in pure mathematics are now useful to you in your current job in a indirect or maybe direct, both ways, right?
Both ways, right? So 2019, I was in Paris, but I did not have funding for my next postdoc. So I came back to Finland applying for both postdocs and industry positions, as I was unemployed at that moment. And then I was employed by OP Financial Group before I got an offer for an academic position. And 3 months into that, the pandemic started, which pretty much closed down everything. And I was happy with my current situation. Maybe it was a lifesaver, not being stuck somewhere else. And then kind of the rest is history. So most of my career I worked during the time of the pandemic. When I transitioned from academia, in this case into banking, and also when I applied for jobs, I was not very familiar with how my skill set would transfer into another job. Now, of course, it's more easy to say, and perhaps it's also important to emphasize that it happens in surprising ways. So for a mathematician, it's not just about looking very narrowly at how can I do math outside of academia, because of the narrow way to look at math outside of academia. So for example, how do you look at math outside of academia? It's mainly programming and doing calculus. What if you're like a topology professor? Well, you will have great opportunities, but then you have to look at it from a wider perspective. What are the benefits, like way of abstract thinking, organizing things, those kind of elements, which are very beneficial, following rule-based, complex discussions. There's much to it more than like analysis.
This is very, very valuable. I think like many people who watch this are academics who are applying to industrial positions, and they want to advertise themselves somehow. And they're writing in their CV that I have experience I have postdoc in this university and this university, and I've published 25 papers in this journal. And doesn't say anything to the industrial decision makers. And so, and they don't even know, like you didn't know 4 years ago what would be your biggest strength as a mathematician coming from the university. So what do you think, how can these people advertise themselves? What should they put in their CVs, or even like, this free text part of the CV? How do you?
I think in particular, to start with, it's important to show that you're really serious about shifting from academia into industry. And this you can do very easily. So it's a low-hanging fruit to take some basic course in programming, something very basic, so that if you end up in an interview where they ask you some questions, I've been in many interviews where I have no clue, and then I look it up and I'm like, okay, that's super simple. I should just have known the word. So they just look at this, that you have somehow looked into some topics. And this is just to be able to have discussions in interviews. But then when you look at what part of your skill set is actually useful, no one will doubt your skills in math because you have already proven that. But they might not know what other skill sets you actually come with. That might be, for example, if you've written academic research papers, you're probably very skilled at writing, producing correct documents that are understandable. If you're involved in some process and you need to transfer that process to someone else, you have taught at the university, you are probably pretty good at teaching and communicating what you have done and how you do it. People with research background are also very structured, so they might contribute with a very structured and good approach to solving problems. They are good at solving problems because they have also solved problems their whole life. And this is very intangible, but most employers will realize this in a very short time, that, okay, this person is very good at solving problems and coming up with good ideas. Also explaining complex notions. This is something they always ask you to be able to do, and which most people fail at all the time. And I also fail at it, and I realize it constantly, but I would still say that you come with a big advantage, because in math you have been taught how to use words precisely, also to understand that they come with very specific meanings, and sometimes you will be able, and most times, to communicate very clearly. These are all attributes you come with that you don't think about first. Maybe you just stress about how you make some or how you prove that you're good at applying math elsewhere, whereas you come with a lot of
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. These are non-obvious things that I think people who are trying to get a job should be able to advertise, like because the decision makers don't know this either in the beginning, unless they have already hired mathematicians before.
And then, of course, you should be also open. You have done maybe math or research your whole life. You come with a large skill set. It's also a good opportunity to look at what you have outside of academia. You have lots of options. You might not just go into one narrow box, but you might have more than you guess.
Mm.
So it's also a good thing to realize that you should apply to those.
Right.
And you are a quick learner also. So
Yeah.
that also helps. So when you get your foot in, then you
Yeah.
can start using that skill for your own benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. Mathematicians, to go through the PhD process and the postdoc process, you must learn how to learn quickly, new things, new concepts, and in my experience, mathematicians are very versatile thinkers. Like you can talk with them almost about anything usually because yeah, I don't know, this kind of proclivity to abstract thought and abstracting from one domain and applying in another domain and connecting different patterns in one domain to another domain is like very everyday work for them. So yeah.
And it's still something very few people do. So a big problem for organizations is that how do you train people? But if you employ someone who shows interest, has a research background, they are going to teach themselves because they have been teaching others and themselves their whole life. So most likely they will pursue the new career with some flavor of this. So they might actually become very interested and start to look at the details and develop it further because it's second nature to them. They don't need someone to have a one-day workshop on how to be creative and learn because they already had a life that it's very much in their spirit.
They could teach that.
Yeah, they could teach that, of course.
Right.
But can you teach that attitude? That comes from something deeper.
Right. What's first, chicken or egg?
Yeah.
Right. So okay. So and what do you miss most in academic world?
I miss my colleagues. I miss the culture. Math was very focused on exactly solving the problems. You did not have other things disturbing you outside of academia. It's a mix of everything that I'm still struggling to come in terms with. Then of course I also miss the nature of math. When you solve a problem, you publish a paper, the result is there forever. It doesn't change. Outside of academia, you do something maybe in 4 months or 1 year, you redo it, or it becomes old or something. So you don't leave this. Maybe it's a romantic picture of an everlasting impact, but it's still, when you do it once in math, it's then and there.
Of course, that's how it is.
But in many other fields, of course, you don't have this. That results don't become old. It's a luxury in math.
Yeah,
that I miss.
I feel like, I have a paper which has the least citations out of all my papers. For a long time, it had one citation. Now it has maybe 7. But I'm personally, that's the work I'm most proud of. Just because I know I did it alone, I solved the problem, it's going to be solved forever. I don't care how many citations I get for it. I know I solved it. And somehow it brings me certain pleasure. Just, even though it's probably absolutely useless, or maybe it's a part of a bigger theory, etc. But it's like there's some mathematical beauty to it. But now you are, and I think there is certainly also beauty in using mathematics. And this is my next question. You're now working in a field which is closer to people, to people's problems, to society problems. We can come back later what it is exactly, banking, insurance. Do you feel positive about the fact that your work has now more purpose in this sense?
Ah, the sense of having purpose is very tricky. It has an immediate purpose, of course, but does it have a long-lasting purpose, and towards what kind of a future is it? That is a very, very somehow complex question. I think when did research, you might have some results that are very satisfying, which you think are not that useful. Of course, looking back at the history of math, we should not do this mistake, as I think Hardy did when he spoke something about applications of number theory. And also, if you look at the history of number theory, it was never developed for those purposes. So, of course, something we imagine as completely useless now might be useful in the future, and something we consider useful now might be completely useless. So that's kind of like, if you put your happiness in terms of that, you're on a very slippery slope where we have all been and are constantly. So I think purpose can be a very broad concept, what you do in daily life, work combined with everything else.
How do you feel about your work?
My current work, I think I would judge it as in the same way as I did in academia, that I think that, okay, it might not be that useful, but actually when you look at it, so what I do for work actually is that we mainly develop phone-wide stress tests. So we look at different developments that can happen in the world. And then you do a lot of simulations all over the bank, and then you put the results together to see where you end up, let's say, if something would happen. So you can simulate all kinds of stressed scenarios and try to find out where the vulnerabilities of the financial system lie, and then you determine how you manage that risk. And if everything goes well, no one ever knows about your work and everything goes fine. And if everything goes wrong and the scenario actually realizes, then still all of the resolution process and everything should run smoothly. And then if the bank closes down and all the people still have their money left and everything is well, then you have done a good job. But of course, you never want that to realize. So in this sense, you never get the satisfaction of seeing the results of the work.
I see. But they probably change the internal mechanics based on your results.
They do.
If you find out about some vulnerability, they fix it. So you're contributing to the safety, the flexibility or rigidity of the banking system.
Exactly. And here the point is not maybe knowing what you should do, but knowing what you should not do. That's usually more easy to answer, because we cannot predict the future, but we can definitely see what are bad options.
I see.
But finding a good option
well, I have my money in your bank.
Okay.
In the bank you work in. So I'm happy. Like, as you ask me, I think it is purposeful.
So far, so good.
So far, so good, right? So, I mean, it's a really important building block of the kind of safe society. Like, in Finland, we live almost in a paradise. We can trust banks, we can trust the public transportation system, etc. Like we live in a smooth society where everything seems to work, but we rarely think what is behind it. And I think people like you are behind this feeling of safety and predictability, and which is building block of our well-being.
Of course, finance, it's like a big plumbing system. So you have like the US, and then you have the Silicon Valley Bank, and it went belly up. And then, of course, you suddenly think like, how will that impact Finland and what went wrong? Of course, it can have impact. You might have complicated financial products, something chokes up, and then it goes very quickly in the finance world. So, of course, you have to be very well aware of what caused that and why it did not end up being a bigger problem and what was the root cause of that. And they are many times very fascinating, in the end, abstract things that you change and then you end up in some situation like here. I think one of the reasons behind the Silicon Valley Bank was that they changed the Dodd-Frank Act on some elements of accounting when Trump became president, which made it possible for this disaster to happen. And in the Europe, we don't have this issue at the moment, and you can see it when you look at your accounting systems and everything. You can see that it's fine. And then we learn like, okay, it's good that we are doing risk management the way we are doing, and if you would notice it's their issue as well, it would hopefully have been fixed.
Okay.
So
do you enjoy the fact that now you understand these worldly dynamics? Because I feel mathematicians, including myself, are usually very ignorant about these things. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if this is even true, but it's a stereotype, and I am this stereotype. And it's a paradox because when I wanted to become a mathematician, one of my reasons was that mathematics is kind of the key to everything. So I felt if I understand mathematics, then it gives me the possibility to understand economics and physics, etc. But then you get stuck in mathematics and you never get to that point. But now you are in the position that you can actually understand the current situation in the world.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. When I started at the University of Helsinki, I wrote a master's in theoretical physics because I wanted to understand the world. I was like, if I look up at the sky and see the stars and so forth, I really want to understand what I'm looking at. And then in 2008, December, I switched to math because at some point I realized that a lot of understanding is hidden underneath the math. So you study general relativity and you kind of like you understand the equations and so forth, but then you have this nagging thing. It's almost classical. What are these infinitesimals that they throw around and these things that they do, and what is differential geometry and how does all this work and how does space actually curve? How does it actually curve? So this that you really want to understand the definitions. And then I got involved in math with I imagined that I would always go back to physics and cosmology. And then I got sucked into it. So of course, math in itself is so fascinating that you go deeper and deeper into all kinds of fascinating topics. And this was exactly what happened to me. So by 2019, I was working very far from any applications to real life. And then the pandemic happened, the switch over from academia to industry. And then kind of this application of math, or maybe more the thinking of math, the way to look at things and organize them in their mind to somehow try to understand what I was getting myself involved in banking. So to begin with, I did not understand much. It was like hedge accounting and balance sheet control, and I was like, what is this? And then you realize that these concepts ring a bell, they sound familiar. Then you realize, okay, what is hedge accounting? You take these Taylor series of different polynomials that cancel each other. These are the terms of the sensitivities that the traders speak about. And then this is what happens in bookkeeping. And then you become fascinated with it. But it's this skill to learn and try to understand, kind of a curiosity. So I became curious about risk management. I would not say I understand much of it when it comes to its, how complex it is, and I think most people would admit to this, but there is a lot to understand, and it's an interesting topic in itself that can be satisfying to many people.
Right. Yeah. So in your new work, you are able to use your mathematical skills in direct and indirect way. And we had already a failed attempt to start recording this where I asked you about this, and you said that you can recognize certain set theoretic aspects in this banking world, and these are things that nobody ever teaches in the banking schools. But it's something that as a mathematician, you come in and you quickly see these patterns.
Exactly. So one example is that the bank's balance sheet is split into two. You have the trading book and the banking book, and this comes from regulation. And very quickly, when you read regulation, you will realize that they only define the conditions for the trading book, and the banking book is defined as its complement. And then you immediately realize the similarities to set theory. And yeah, I think risk management is great for people who enjoy set theory.
Interesting.
And then you will also realize people's vain attempts when they try to give conditions for banking book that has been defined as the complement of the trading book. You might understand that this might be very difficult to do. Can you even do it, or where will you end up? So it's these kind of aspects that are, for example, involved. So it's more than just stochastic processes, which is just like one part of math. Then you have all kinds of different ways how people, when you have like a rule book, I think capital requirements regulation is like 700 pages of criteria and rules. And then someone asks you a question, and then you have to like, how do you deduce that? Is that correct or wrong? And then, of course, a mathematician can try to come up with like a counter example or something.
Right.
So you can really leverage your background in these complex discussions just because you're used to deductions from definitions and counter examples and these kind of things that underlie complex governance processes.
So yeah, we're skilled at thinking. We're skilled at coming up with this is a good example, counter example. So people make rules, and a mathematician has the training to immediately like find ways to break them. You know, like basically test how robust these rules are. This is what we do all the time with axioms and in group theory, in topology, whatever. This is the first thing we always do when we see a list of axioms is that, okay, what satisfies these axioms but has strange properties. So we call these things counterexamples, and it really requires years of training to be able to think in this way. And that's another thing I think that we should be able to advertise to the decision makers and the hiring managers that, look, this is a skill, this is a thing, and I'm good at it. Right?
Yeah, and you can notice immediately, like when you have like a regulation or directive, it's just like a bullet list of items from where you should start, and then you do what follows from them. And if you do one of these incorrectly, you will very soon see that this leads later on to an issue. You will notice this as a mathematician. You're like, if you define it in this way, then you apply these things, then you end up in this situation. And then in a bank, it realizes in the way that, oh, this was not ever taken to a committee and the decision was never made because you had this whole weird gap in the process and everyone just applies these rules. And then you realize, okay, it should be defined differently, and then you can fix it and smoothen it up. It's kind of like these things you never discuss in academia, where you can apply your skills to these kind of like rule-based systems. That's what governance processes are. And they usually run into problems when they have been badly designed, and then they have all real-life implications.
Interesting. I remember several years ago, I think about when you were starting your industrial job, we talked about this, and you said at the time that maybe your part of the brain that is specialized in mathematics will just sit there useless and get atrophied. But now uh, we see that it wasn't. It's kind of involved, and you're still keeping up with some serious
So
things.
I think I thought about math maybe in a too isolated way because I never worked on anything else. So I thought if I don't work on that, it disappears. It's some dark locker there that gets dusty and just evaporates, but it doesn't happen. I mean, my colleagues also pointed out that maybe I work still in a way very typical for a mathematician. So kind of that way of problem solving just leaked its way into or outside of academia. I usually read articles, archive, or follow up on new results. Or then if you have the opportunity to referee some paper close to your own field of research, then in this way you can still give a valuable contribution by actually doing what you know, but still in a very, I mean, if you're in academia, you referee papers on top of everything else. If you still like it, you can do it also outside of academia alongside your work. So it's a way to contribute if you don't have time to think about some research problem on your own, which would of course be the ideal, but people with research background most likely also approach their new job in the same vigorous fashion, so they become very quickly consumed about learning about the new job, and then that leaves very little time for other things if you don't organize for that.
Right. How much of your work today is programming? How much is social, like meetings? No, are you in organizational position? Do you manage projects, or do you like what's?
So I would say during the past year, there's been some programming, which is mostly ad hoc projects related to something not being yet implemented. I'm looking at like working papers. Could this be applied at Nordea or not? So you look at different options. That's kind of a side project that they give that you can allocate time to. I mean, if you don't have anything else, you do that. You still try to put time in the calendar for doing this kind of like programming. And then we have, of course, the responsibility of driving these stress tests throughout the bank. So that's a lot of project management between like over 10 different teams that have to be organized with deadlines and committees, and then they submit the results. And then usually what I do is that I sanity check them. I check that everything's included, that it makes sense, that they are correctly compiled. There's nothing more easy to do than add two numbers that should not be added. So then you use very much like knowledge. You also have to know how a stress test should be done. So for example, the European banking authorities do a stress test every second year. Just the methodology is 200 pages long. Wow. So you have to really keep up to see if the people who submit the results to you did it properly, because not every one of them, of course, read those 200 pages.
Oh, wow.
So project management is a large part. Then you might have daily tasks. Some risk metrics are reached in the bank. Should it be escalated? Have the right persons been involved? Should this go to some committee? What should be done? Usually people ask for advice. I am not in charge of any risk metrics if they get breached or so, but people might call me up and say like, okay, we're going to do this. Is this the correct way? Or should we do something before that? These kind of like ad hoc tasks. And then it's a lot of reading. So you read about risk management theory, regulations, guidelines, so that you actually learn to do the job.
Seems like a lot of pages already. By this time we have 900 pages in total. You just mentioned. You probably didn't mention a lot of other things.
It's a lot of reading. Getting to know.
Do you read also like research papers in that like financial math or? data science or?
So I would say, if you're looking at some new methodologies, you might look at some research papers, but usually it's more soft. It can be like how some, let's say, new regulations will impact something and what should be accounted for in the future, or if there's going to be some changes to risk management over the next few years through regulations. I would not say they are research papers in that sense. It's more about following up on the future and what's kind of like happening in the financial world.
Okay.
But you can, of course, have more academic side projects.
I'd like to go back to speaking about dancing. In your interview with the Finnish TV channel, you said that when you do math, you might forget to breathe, but when you dance, you only concentrate on breathing. I really like that quote. Another quote I liked was when you said that in order to solve or get a new idea or to make progress in mathematics or dance, you have to let go of thinking. Ajattelusta luopumisen taito. I'm Finnish. So these two things.
So exactly when you forget to breathe, you have definitely not, like, you are definitely connected to your mind and not to your body, and you have definitely not let go. And I don't know when ideas pop up, but usually they pop up when you, in some sense, at least let go of controlling your own thoughts, and they just float freely. And when they float freely, you might not even notice anything happening. You might not even think when they are really floating freely. And this is something that happens in dance. So you really focus on your body, you let your mind go. Maybe you visualize something, maybe you don't do it, and maybe the next morning you suddenly have this solution to your original problem just because you let it go for a while. If you just keep on hammering at it, the solution might never come. And I think maybe mathematicians are also trained in finding out ways to provoke these moments of insight, that they know what's required for an idea, and then they try to build up the right environment, doing something else, going for a walk, whatever it requires.
I think the number of mathematicians who died in mountain climbing is particularly high.
Yes.
Alexandrov, Urizon, I'm not sure that this off the top of my head. I think some of those Russian topologists, like you look at their Wikipedia pages and died mountain climbing, died mountain. What is this thing? And I think that's the answer, is that they needed this radical adrenaline or radical activity that shuts down their intellectual brain so that they can open up to breathing the fresh air, and this way also the thoughts get freed up. Yeah,
you need to do something. If you're very stressed, try to solve a problem and try to go to sleep. That will not solve the problem usually. You have to somehow let it go before you go to sleep.
Yeah, many people cannot fall asleep if they
exactly.
Wow, interesting. And you still dance actively?
I still dance actively. So now for a few years, 2 years, I've just done it for fun of it, to develop myself. Earlier, we did a lot of performances together with Tahdittomat, which is a folk dance ensemble. We toured around for 10 years.
Wow.
And it's a very different kind of dancing when you do choreographies. It's very structured. make it like very precise and so forth. Otherwise, you can also practice dancing more freely, where you're more focused on developing your technique than perfecting a choreography. That's one of the things that have lasted. So even if I switched from academia to industry, I've continued to dance. So it plays the same role in my life as in academia. It's a way to disengage for a while, get inspiration, enjoy myself.
And the job, even though it's not pure mathematics at the moment, but you still feel that there is this balance between dance and the technical work, or
I think so. Somehow the role is, of course, different. What I miss from research is, of course, research, but otherwise it's a very good complement. So it also helps in solving problems, even though the problems might be a bit different. It still plays the same role.
yeah. No, this is just it's fascinating to me. I always try to find. Actually, I used to have a podcast project kind of long time ago, which is now shut down, and it's impossible to find those recordings anywhere. Maybe I'll publish them again at some point. But I had a idea of connecting art with mathematics, and I did interview mathematicians who do art, like with fractals or something, or I interviewed one artist who actually made a contribution to geometry. He invented a new type of tiling, kind of a generalization of Penrose tiling.
Yeah.
And but I never encountered anyone dancing and doing mathematics and finding these connections. That's just fascinating to me. I don't know. Have you ever thought of like a mathematical dance, or like a dance which would illuminate some mathematical ideas, like even maybe educational purpose or something like that?
I think, of course, one of the most immediate connections between art and math could be the way math is illustrated in arts. You have like the Julia set, and you can have like Escher's pictures of hyperbolic geometry and so forth. And these are kind of evident, so they are kind of like art of mathematical ideas, but then you also have this more abstract level of thoughts and what kind of people do math. Why do they enjoy math and maybe dance? Is there something in their underlying structure that's connected? And in some sense, math is just about an abstract concept. What is dance about? You build it up from fundamental blocks. Maybe there is nothing else is there. You're like expressing yourself as you express yourself in math. So there is this more abstract, non-visual connection also that I appreciate a lot, which is not so evident. It's like you look at some number and you see nothing particular about that number, but the underlying number theory might be absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And then presenting that number in itself will not be art, but you cannot somehow express the underlying math to a non-mathematician easily either.
Yeah.
And maybe that there is something why a mathematician dances and enjoys it. There is some other level that you take into account.
Beautiful. So maybe then another set of questions is perhaps, what are the tips to someone who is in an academic career today and they're looking for to find either they're just simply interested in finding purpose in a more hands-on industrial job or something like this. We already touched on so take some basic programming course. What else? You went to many interviews. What's your experience? Like, what was surprising? What was easy?
I think most of the interviews have been very different in nature. I think one important aspect is to believe in yourself and apply for different positions. So of course it's important to have some information. So it's a good idea to do a basic programming course, maybe something, if you look at data science, something basic about data science to show that you're serious about it. And then usually in interviews, they can ask you about different terminology and so forth. So of course, you don't want to get stuck just because you did not know the name of a thing, because you could have been able to discuss about it. So it's important to somehow learn a bit of the language. But otherwise, I think in interviews, they also test your personality and fit. One is, of course, that when you leave academia, you might have to start kind of a new career. So you should not be too serious about it. It's like, for me, it was also like a junior position, and 1.5 year later, a senior position. So it was like a very quick transition, but you have to start somewhere, and then you can use your skills to learn to very quickly come up. And this is maybe a good hint. It depends, of course, on the topic, but for some, like, even if, of course, someone who has done a PhD could be considered for a senior position, they might just lack the time required to learn some topics. So you just like need time to digest the information, and then of course they will quickly bring you up to that level if you're really engaged. So don't be afraid to apply for also junior positions and trust in yourself to then get promoted. And then also to try in the interviews, if someone asks you, like, you don't have to prove anymore that you're like good at math.
Right.
You should try to prove that you have other skills, and in showing that you can use your math skills. I mean, you're amazing at deducing things, so you will probably perform well in all the interviews and discussions. Also, if it's some position you're not so interested in, you can go there to have the practice. It's always good, because you don't want your first interview to be to your dream place, because that's going to be your first interview, so you can make some silly mistakes, you can freeze, you can perform badly. Everyone has like bad days in interviews. They don't always go as planned.
Both the interviewee and the interviewer.
So you have to do them, and you might also end up in an interview where you realize that this is definitely not the job. Then if you still have a job and you're thinking about shifting, then you can consider if it's a good fit for you or not. So it's an opportunity to also get to learn one another. And you can ask in interviews if they say, like, okay, so you were not the right fit, then you can ask, what are you looking for, to kind of learn for the future.
You can take interviews as exercises.
Yes.
You can just you shouldn't be afraid of rejection, because I mean, the more interviews you do, the more experience you have.
Yeah.
And then you can ace them faster and better. And that's a very interesting point that you say, that you can apply for a low-level position, and then you will find your way up quickly. So not to be afraid of that. It's a very important point. And I think after Rami said the exact same thing, by the way, in my previous podcast episode, that mathematicians always try to prove themselves in math, But in these interviews, you don't have to do that because they already see from your PhD and your publications that that's your strong part. That they're not even interested because in the university world, you always hang out with people who are like in your area. They know stuff you don't know. They're better than you in some, either in your area or in a nearby area. And it's always very humbling to meet them. We go to conferences, we actually meet the best people in the world on a regular basis, which is, in my opinion, like a big advantage of academia in which maybe is kind of a culture that we should try to bring also more into the industry world, because in industry, and yeah, tell me what you think about this. Like, there's a lot of competition between companies, so there's not so much sharing. So there's a lot of NDAs and everything. So there is no culture of, oh, I'm a risk analyst. Let me go to a conference where I meet with the best risk analysts in the world and share all my ideas with them and get their opinions, right?
So I think this varies. Maybe I come back one earlier point here about the junior position. So in that, of course, you have to keep in mind it has to be a position where you can grow and learn. This is something to pay attention for in the interview. Is the team, for example, does it have like senior people who you can learn from? And you will also notice this quite quickly. So you should, of course, always try to be in a place where you have sparring partners and can grow in the role. So that's very important. And then when it comes to this sharing, that depends on what you are doing. Of course, in finance, the medallion fund would not tell how they are running their portfolio in Renaissance technologies. That's one part. So it's like a hedge fund. But as most banks around the world operate, it's a very, somehow, at least to a mathematician, a very classic environment of where you apply obvious ideas. The problem is usually how to implement them, which might be very difficult. So at least in risk management, people are not that secretive, also because you have to follow some rules. They noticed in the financial crisis that when people have their own models predicting the risk, of course, they all predicted that they have no risk, and the rest is history. So it went into these somehow standardized approaches where you are allowed to model some parts, and elsewhere you follow standard approaches, and then usually people quite really share information about methodologies and so forth. But of course, you also have information that's not available even within the company. You can only share it with some people. You see financial statements and these kind of things that you can, of course, not discuss. You can discuss the theory, but you cannot discuss the numbers.
Okay. Yeah. Well, but that's fine,
kind of,
right?
So I would say it's in that sense good, but you can see aspects of what you're saying in that most of the articles and so forth are behind paywalls, which is of course unheard of.
Right.
You have archive and people share things. It's not that you have to pay like 7,000 euros for a yearly subscription of some magazine.
Right.
But you can have access to preprints and so forth. And actually, you can find some of these preprints on Archive, and you see that they appear in some expensive magazine. You just go to Archive, and there you go.
Yeah,
So then
and
being familiar with the literature.
Yes, and other ways to find, and old school library works still, I guess. Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think when you make the change or decide to look outside of academia, it's completely natural to feel that you miss part of that culture and that you will miss it. But then you also end up in a lot of unfamiliar territory. I did not have like an industry CV. I did not have a LinkedIn profile. I did not know how to look for jobs. So the first step, I guess, is to create your LinkedIn profile, look at examples of simplified short CVs, and then start to apply for jobs. I would say in general, as a mathematician, you should look a bit outside of the box because your education is also outside of the box. So it might apply to surprising jobs that you don't think about, and don't just narrow it down to doing numeric math, because probably when you did research, did you even use a computer?
Yeah.
So you should not suddenly start to look at it too narrowly, but you should look for opportunities. And I mean, risk management is one good, and there might be other exciting opportunities. So you should be really open-minded, that I would say. And then you should always go with you should be practical. So sometimes you just have to take a job. But you should also try to some extent pursue what you want to do. And then, of course, there are different ways to remain in contact with academia, people, following up, reading, refereeing, whatever.
My dream would be to somehow have positions where mathematicians can work on industrial problems for 3 days a week. And 2 days a week, they could do their own research.
Yeah.
I don't know how I'm going to achieve that. Originally, I thought that maybe Manifold Solutions can hire people as consultants, and that's what they would be able to do, maybe in the future. But another thing I'm thinking about, like if Manifold Solutions grows into a respected headhunting agency, which it is already, but if we gain more respect in the sense that I'm able to make contracts with the clients, where, for example, Nordea would hire somebody through me, through Manifold Solutions, and we would make a deal that this person that they hire has to have like free time to do research. Do you think it would be like feasible? Maybe there is like an 1 year of immersive period where you have to learn about the new job, but then you could transition into doing less time per week. Do you think that would work in your area, for example?
It's kind of tricky. I think, of course, you can, for example, work for 80% and then kind of think you have 1 day for research. But somehow you also have to have an environment where you feel inspired. And this, I think, definitely can work for those people who actually want to have 2 careers. So they really want to do it. And I think there are a lot of people who would be definitely interested in that opportunity, because it's not always about the choice, industry and academia. It would be ideal for some people that it could be both, so that they can kind of compensate.
Right.
And then you can decide where you work more and less, and kind of find a balance. I think all of these black and white choices in life are probably not the best ones. So finding a midway solution might work perfectly for some people and might be the best solution. And it's not to be effective at work that means 5 days. I mean, maybe 3 days, all it takes, then you should do something else to again get the new ideas for the next. So also when you do research, Matt, you cannot do research every day. You can maybe do it for a few days a week, then probably need to do something else or dance or relax or something. Or if you do a long research project, you might not start the next one immediately. It depends on the persons, because it can also be extremely, depends on the research project. Some research projects can be really taxing.
Yeah.
And then you kind of like, okay, now I need to just like read literature, get inspiration, become creative again. You cannot be constantly creating. And I think this 5-day work week is perhaps changes should be made to it to accommodate.
Do you think the companies would be allergic to this because they want a committed worker, and if they hear that you want to do something else, do you think they'd be?
I think it depends on what kind of job it is. It's quite normal to have people do 4-day work weeks if they work like 80%. If they work for 3 days, it might be suitable for some position. For another position, it might be that when they have been away for 2 days, they have so many emails and so much to catch up that they cannot kind of be efficient in those 3 days. But of course, not all positions are like that. You might have like positions where you don't have to be exposed to this kind of information flows, where it more depends that you're more independent and not other people are not dependent on you. And for such positions, it can be
very cool, very interesting. Okay. I think we can wrap up at this. Hey, Juhani, thank you very much for being on this podcast. I hope we'll have another opportunity to do this again in a year or something to see how things are going and what's new. And I really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. Okay.